turn on the recording. All right, welcome everyone to the May, I had to think for a minute, the May Access to Justice Board meeting. Good to see you all. What we have decided, we are going to make more of our program here is to move as much as we can to the public session so that we can, as a board, be more transparent about the work that we're doing. So you will notice over the next several months, I think that the working session will get longer and our own executive or the public session will get longer and our own working session or executive session will be shorter. And we're going to try this as a new model. To start off with, we need to approve the minutes. There's already been one amendment noted, which is that the date says May, but it should say April. So that will be changed for the final record. Other than that, are there any changes or amendments to the minutes? Hearing none, can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve.
All right, I second.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Dave. All right. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye or raise your hands.
Aye.
All right, the minutes. Any opposed? Any abstain? The minutes are approved. Right, I would like to give a brief update about the OCLA director search process. So the search committee met almost 2 weeks ago. There were 8 proposals submitted by search firms. The committee narrowed that down to 4 that they would like to hear more information from. Those 4 firms were contacted. They are submitting their additional information by this afternoon.
Recording in progress.
So for the OCLA search, those 4 remaining search firms are submitting their additional information by this afternoon. That is being sent out to the search committee, which is meeting Tuesday at noon, Tuesday, May 16th at noon. And they're going to whittle that down probably to 2 firms that are going to be interviewed. And then that decision will be completed for that part of the process will be completed by the end of 4 weeks. By the middle of June, we will have decided on a search firm. Roughly the calendar, and I say roughly, is pick the search firm by June, work with them to post the job description by August, let's say, start to have public job talks after Labor Day, sometime in September, sometime not to conflict with our own Access to Justice conference at the end of September. And then the committee will make its decision in October, early November. The deadline again from the Supreme Court to submit 3 names to them is November 17th, 2023. So that's the current status. Any questions about that?
Just for clarity, I'm new to the board, as everyone knows. Are there any particular attributes or qualifications that are central as far as the director?
Excellent question. Excellent question. I will put in the chat CW 2.53.020. Feel like I have not committed to memory, but so the statute lays out a few attributes. The statute was written in 2005. There's a very good argument that shoulda, coulda, woulda been updated before the search, but that didn't happen. So the one sticking point issue has been that the statute requires, and we were unable to get a waiver of this, that the director have 5 years admission to practice in Washington. So that is, we were unable to get a waiver of that. The Supreme Court is aware of it, and we are bound by that in our search. Our search materials stressed, and the materials that were sent out in the request for proposal stressed the role of OCLA in terms of funding civil legal aid delivery systems that take into consideration racial equity as a paramount duty. And so that's not in statute, but that is in the materials. Fred, before I get to you, Mike or SB, is there anything you want to add to that? Or Cesar, sorry.
No, thanks.
Okay. Jeremiah, does that answer somewhat your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Fred.
Terry, you
Well,
touched on it.
Oops.
Terry,
Sorry,
you
Judge.
touched on it. You touched on the practice of in Washington, the 5-year requirement. I just point out, I think that that's one of those things that is a tremendous limiting factor. We don't know who the candidates are. For example, let's say the assistant OCLA director for California, who had lots of experience and understands what's going on, is moving up here because his wife has taken a job at the University of Washington Medical School. I mean, this could be the best candidate we could have, and their practice of law, the fact, and maybe they grew up in the state of Washington, but happened to be in California. It just is you shouldn't make the decisions from the grave. You should make the decisions based on the candidates. And I think that my voice on this was push hard for change, but the change, other people disagreed with me on that. But, we probably cut out half of the good candidates by what I think is an improvident criteria.
Thank you, Fred. I do not disagree. Mike and I had this conversation in the car on our way to Wenatchee. Yeah, I will say that my personal recommendation, and we can discuss whether it's a recommendation of the Access to Justice Board to the Supreme Court when the search is over, is that the statute needs to be rewritten. Statute needs to be, but I will also say, based on the input that I've received from the community, the minute we start a process to rewrite the statute, there are a lot of people in the community who think many parts of that statute need to be revised. Starting with, do you need a lawyer at all to run OCLA, or do you need a contract administrator? We're talking about an agency that has $130 million worth of contracts. So my recommendation, which I will present to the board in December when the whole thing is done, is to recommend to the Supreme Court that they rewrite that statute. Other questions or comments about the OCLA director search? I will just add, while we're on the subject of OCLA, is that we sent out an advertisement to the listserv that we are also recruiting for 2 members of the OCLA Oversight Committee. There are 2 members who are terming out at the end of June, and we will have the ability, it is the Access to Justice Board who interviews and makes nominations to for appointment to the Oversight Board. very happy to report that our board member, Vanna Singh, is the chair of that committee. And so if you know people who are interested in serving on the OCLA Oversight Board, please respond to the advertisement, and because we will be on that early summer to get somebody appointed. Welcome to our new folks who just arrived. Now, moving on to the Access to Justice Board Chair-elect process. I will just say briefly that according to our operating rules, it is about this time that the board is going to go through a process to pick among the existing board members who is going to be the next chair. Chairs serve for 2 years. This will be start in October. So it is about this time when we pick the next chair for next year. So I think people interested in serving as chair from among the board members should contact Bonnie and let her know that. Any questions?
I
Maybe
just have a
just,
question. Oh, go ahead, Bonnie.
no, you go ahead first.
I have a question about the ATJ chair-elect. So it starts in October, and then the position starts in October, or the elect position starts in October? Just to clarify, I didn't understand the timeline.
Yeah, the elect positions, I would say, starts in October because the chair starts in October. So you want to have a 1-year overlap. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And what's the qualifications other than being existing board member for that?
I believe the qualification is you have to be a board member for more than a year.
Okay.
Bonnie.
I was just going to share in terms of timing, and Terry, maybe you already said this, the board will need to vote on who the chair-elect is at the September meeting. So it would be helpful to have nominations or self-nominations by the August meeting so we can begin the process of discussing it.
Thank you. And I think when we talked roughly about the Access to Justice Conference plan for that, there will be time, I believe that our Access to Justice board meeting will be at the conference in person, right, in September, at the end of September, either, I think that Friday morning, the 29th. So that's where we would do the voting. Other questions? As long as we're talking, I'm going to switch order. As long as we're talking about the board, let's talk about recruitment to the board, and then we'll come back and talk about awards. So Dave.
So really not much of an update on recruiting other than to say, I think the deadline is today. Is that right, Bonnie?
That's correct.
Yeah, so the application deadline is today. We had already extended it. So it's extended to today. And the committee has met. And I know that we have a ton of placeholders on our calendars for board interviews, but I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Bonnie, I don't think that we've sent out invitations yet for interviews, but I would imagine that's going to happen soon.
Right. Yeah. The committee is meeting on Monday to review all the applications and make those decisions about who to invite for an interview.
Thanks for reminding me. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. And again, if I didn't say this, we have 2 board positions that we are filling this year. So we'll have 2 people cycling off. Jeremiah.
Terry, I had one note, and I'm going to double check. I looked online because in order to double check and see what the date was for the applications to close. And for some reason, I thought it said June 2nd. And this was despite me talking with Bonnie and her clearing me up. So I don't know if I saw something wrong or if that's what's on there right now, but I'm going to try to find it just in case that might need to be updated.
Yeah, you didn't see something wrong. It gets a little bit confusing because the Bar Association uses the same application portal for all bar entities. And there are a number of bar entities that do have a June 2nd application deadline.
I see.
I know it can get a
Oh,
little confusing, but the ATJ board is closing it sooner because our process takes a little bit longer.
got it. So we can say end of business day today.
Yeah, sounds good.
And just to give everyone a little piece of information about the process, when the board selects the two people, it has to go first to the BOG, it has to go to the Bar Board of Governors, and they have to approve it. And then it goes to the Supreme Court and they have to approve it, which is why if we have openings coming October 1st, we need to do this now because those steps obviously take a while. All right. If there's no other questions or comments about that, I will go back on our agenda to the board awards process. Bonnie.
Yeah, this is just another quick process update. So for folks who are newer to the board, every time we have an Access to Justice conference, we give out 6 Access to Justice Board awards at the conference. For the past couple of months, we've been collecting nominations for those 6 awards. And the deadline to nominate folks closed recently. And so I'm going to be compiling all of the nominations and sharing them out with the board members to review. And it would be helpful to have 2 or 3 volunteer board members to plan to meet over the next month to kind of do a deep dive on those nominations and come up with a recommendation for the full board to consider at the June meeting to vote on who will actually receive the award. So you can, if you're interested in helping select the award recipients, you can let me know now, or I'll send an email on Monday with a reminder and folks can let me know if you're interested in doing that.
You can add me to the list, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you, Jeremiah. Questions about that? All right. ATJ Board stipends request update, Diana.
Okay, so if the board or everybody remembers, the ATJ board had voted to approve, it wasn't actually an official policy, but a decision to move forward with requesting funding for stipends for ATJ board members with lived experience to pay them some sort of stipend for serving on the board. And we had a work group who did a lot of research and got feedback, which included Vanna, Bryn, I'm forgetting who else, maybe it was Mike. Oh, Michelle. Okay, sorry if I forgot who else. Seems like so long ago, but with a lot of research, which included looking to see what other organizations do around this, which also includes folks here today, what your organizations do to pay people with lived experience. They ultimately at the end, the proposal was to propose a specific amount, which was calculated based on a number of different things, but that amount was $9,000 a year per person who would fit the criteria for a person with lived experience. And once the board made that decision, then the board, then Bonnie and I followed up in terms of, how are we going to find funding to be able to pay that stipend. So 2 things happened. One is we sent a letter, or Terry signed off on sending a letter to Chief Justice Gonzalez to let him know of the decision that the ATJ board made and to ask about funding for that. So to date, so the court acknowledged that they received the letter and they would be discussing it in banc in May. I actually don't know if that's already happened. And we also don't have a written response from Chief Justice Gonzalez other than acknowledging and they would be discussing it. So we don't know yet on the court side whether they would provide funding, increase our funding, to be able to pay for those stipends. And Bonnie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, we actually received an email this morning from the
Oh,
court.
okay.
Because I had asked them for an update on their policy for potentially paying folks with lived experience through the boards and commissions, and they sent me their policy that they're going to move forward with. And it's capped at $600 per person per year, which is quite a bit under the amount that we were hoping to pay board members. So I'm not sure if we want to pursue the policy that the board adopted, if the AOC would be the venue that we could do that through.
Got it. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like AOC, the Administrative Office of the Courts, that's a policy that they're doing agency-wide for any person that would fit in that category. And then presumably that would include the court. So they, by sharing that policy, that's sort of indirectly responding to our request from the court saying, this is what we're deciding. I guess that's a question for you, Bonnie.
That's my assumption. And again, I just received the email this morning, so I think maybe we should follow up on that, but that was the response I got from the request.
Okay, Michelle?
So that's the $600 limit is an AOC policy. I guess my question is, as a court mandated board, are they implying that we are also bound, that we're also bound by that? Or as long as we can find other funding, it's fine? Like is the policy that we passed with the higher stipend fine despite that policy? I guess is my question.
I think it only applies to the funding if we want to use the court funding to pay the individuals. So in terms of that being a pathway to receive the funding, that may be a dead end at this point.
Speak.
Could it be one source? I mean, we could have a few streams coming in to cover that 9,000, and this could be one source, just like everybody else. When you're funding something, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And since this basket is so tiny, does it exempt us from looking at other sources? I think that might be related to Michelle's question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should confirm with AOC and the court that by them having this policy of $600 per person total a year, that I just want to make sure that that's also not a policy that we're limited to that. We could look at other sources, but assuming that's the case, I just wanted to give an update on the, speaking of other sources, of looking to the Bar Association as another potential source for funding the stipends. And so, and we might look at others, but at this point right now, to date, we have sent a request to the court, as I mentioned, and then we also included in our proposed FY24 budget with the Bar Association, and their budget cycle starts on October 1st, whereas the court's budget cycle starts on July 1st. But anyhow, so with the Bar Association budget request, the budget planning process started last month, and Bonnie and I submitted in our proposed budget for the board the stipends for people with lived experience and so right now, in terms of how the budget planning process works, is the first draft is reviewed by the executive leadership team and the budget and audit committee of the Board of Governors, and which includes the treasurer. So just even in this first process of reviewing the budget, that's a time when the budget and audit committee and the executive leadership team identify any sort of big major changes to the budget that was different from the year before, so that they can highlight that for the Board of Governors when they review the first draft, so that they can engage in any sort of discussion, making sure they have the right, all the information they need in terms of making a decision. So Bonnie and I met with Tiffany Lynch, who's our Director of Finance, and Francis Adewale, who we know is the treasurer of the Bar Association, because this is something we've never asked before. It is a significant amount, and it is something that they do want to flagged to the Board of Governors when they review the first draft at their June meeting. And so that's one thing. The other thing is the executive leadership team of the Bar Association also noted, I mean, ultimately, the Board of Governors is the ones that decides what the budget should be, and they have so they're the ones that determine it. But one of the things that they consider are the fiscal policies, and as they're thinking about the budget and what they want to approve, they should probably look to the fiscal policies to make sure anything they approve is in line with the fiscal policies. So, you know, for example, if we propose a budget that we should all go to Disneyland a year, there's no fiscal policy that says, yes, volunteers should all go to Disneyland for a year. And so maybe that's not a good example, but anyhow, the executive leadership team noted there's no fiscal policy around paying people with lived experience to serve as a volunteer on any sort of entity. And then also recognize, I think generally, like, it's great that the ATJ board is proposing this, but also thinking about what about the Bar Association and the other entities within the bar, or even all the Supreme Court created entities at the bar staffs, and thinking maybe this is a good idea for everybody. And so regardless of whether it could potentially apply to all entities or just the ATJ board, there is not an existing fiscal policy from which the Board of Governors can say, like, oh, great, we have a fiscal policy. This is your budget request. We will move forward with approving it or not approving it or whatever decision. But what the executive leadership team is suggesting is that the board, in addition, or sort of preceding its budget request, is to propose a fiscal policy proposal for a new fiscal policy, so that by the time that the Board of Governors is making a decision about the budget, they can see that there's been that there is a fiscal policy. I recognize this might seem a little strange that the ATJ board, which is not a bar entity, would be proposing a bar policy. So I recognize that this seems strange, but we're sort of like living out what we had talked about earlier this year around the taxi cab. That's that committee. The acronym stands, I don't remember, but it's basically, that was the committee of bringing Supreme Court created entity leaders and bar staff to figure out there's sort of this gray area of when non-bar entities that are created by the Supreme Court but staffed by the Bar Association and also funded by the Bar Association, you know, how do we navigate these waters? And so this is an example of recognizing we're navigating somewhat of muddy waters. So getting to the practicality, what Bonnie and I have been talking about, you know, how do we help the board be successful in what you're trying to accomplish? One of which is, how do you get funding for what you're wanting to do? And so we would propose, and a lot of the work has already been done by the work group that made the proposal, is that we can, Bonnie and I can work on a draft proposal of the policy, a draft policy. And we can also check in with our general counsel, who we've already been talking to about any legal concerns that they've identified, and then ultimately submit something to the ATJ board for your review and approval. And then because it is a policy that would impact many different entities and people beyond the ATJ board, we can then solicit feedback and try and make this an inclusive process, because like I said, there are other entities like any of the committees or the councils that might also be interested in a fiscal policy such as this, to give their feedback, and then you can consider the feedback and then ultimately finalize your proposed policy to submit to the Board of Governors. And then in terms of the timing, we're trying to figure out how to do it so that it is aligning with their budget planning process. And so our proposal is that at your June meeting, we would share with you the draft of the policy. Then we would open it up for a month for us to solicit feedback. And then at your July meeting, you can approve it, hopefully. And then for the August Board of Governors meeting, then we would submit it for their review and potential proposal for the policy. And then, sorry, September is when the Board of Governors will look at finalizing or approving the final budget. So this is basically running in tandem. And, obviously timing isn't ideal. It would have been ideal if we would have spent time on the policy last year, and then we could submit it in the budget this year, but we're kind of converging it all at once. And so one thing that Bonnie and I are thinking about is maybe describing this whole process as a pilot process, in that this is something new. This is something a lot of organizations are doing, are sort of forging into this whole area of how do we pay people with lived experience. And so maybe one way to describe this is asking for the ATJ board to be a pilot, that we're piloting this policy and piloting being able to have the funding for this next year. And then from the pilot process, we can learn and potentially, if need be, improve the policy. But then it might give the Board of Governors maybe a little bit of comfort. I'm not really sure of okay, we're not making this huge, gigantic change. We're going to pilot it for a year with the ATJ board, see how it goes, evaluate, and then potentially look to seeing how we could do this organizational wide. So hopefully that makes sense. And others who've been involved with this process, including our Board of Governor liaisons, if you have any thoughts, feel free to jump in. But that is what we're thinking about in terms of how to accomplish what you're trying to do, how to get all the information to the Board of Governors so they can make a decision, and how to create a policy so that the Board of Governors feels like the decisions they're making is sound.
Thank you, Diana. Questions for Diana?
The statement that you made earlier thank you. That was a really good presentation, Diana. Always impressed how you lay everything out and then boom. The comment about it seems weird that we're the ones bringing it up because it's not the BOG, it's it's us bringing it up to the BOG, but it makes perfect sense to me because it's the Access to Justice Board, and we're talking about a process that some organizations have already ventured into, are doing. And this is, I would imagine that maybe there's organizations that have done it way before anybody was even thinking about this, but it is a topic that is coming up more and more with the committees, right? With the different committees that are across the state. And so I just wanted to say that and wondering, just making sure that we're prepared for what kind of arguments might come up or questions that would stop us in its tracks, and not be disappointed if it doesn't happen this time around, but for us to keep looking at the other sources as well. That if the BOG says, yeah, not this time, we're not going to make that decision about a fiscal policy right now, we need more time, that we'll keep working on that. But at the same time, we'll also keep working at finding other sources that might be able to support this. So I think it's kind of thinking out of the box, being really creative, and just being bold and asking entities and people and organizations to help with it that we might normally not do, because it's about access to justice. And people care about that, a lot of people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess I think that will be helpful to just get input all along the way rather than we work in our little corner. And I think I'm grateful that Governor Nguyen and Petrasic, as a BOG liaisons to the ATJ board, I'm grateful that you've been coming to our meetings and can be informed. And I think it will be valuable to get your input along the way, instead of just waiting till August when we present it. So hopefully we could be working with you along the way as well.
Mike.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what SB shared about, I mean, this is the reason that access to justice, is really looking at systemic changes. and how do we actually do outside of the work that we do, but also further, outreaching to other parts of the legal justice system, So what I'm really curious about for folks who are in this meeting is to hear from community members like Saysad or Murph, or a representative from LFW, as are there policies that you use to that you can share? Because I actually think that it's not just an ATJ project, it actually needs to build collaboration among our partners and able to really put this front and center. And so it's not just like, hey, this is ATJ working on this, but how do we actually bring in our partners to really, to really push forward a policy and really bring this to attention, because I think that this is really, really important. And then, so I see this as a multi-strong approach, and this ability to how do we get the political will to move this. The other thing I just had some questions about the AOC saying $600 a year, like it'd be very interesting to know kind of how that number came up. Is it because it was based on they meet once a month, or was it once a year? And, was it an average time that, people with lived experience participate in AOC type activities? So it'd be good to kind of explore and just from a curiosity point, just to ask a little bit more questions and background as to how that amount, because for me, I also agree that amount is very, very small. And I really think it's, if we're really looking at something that we're really valuing people's input, lived experience input on this board, or in any sort of legal entity, I think it needs to reflect the value of that person's input and their participation. So I really think that there's an opportunity to explore a little bit deeper. I love the ideas of looking at other sources. I also think that it needs to be really embedded, as if this is really important, it needs to be embedded across, and something that we can all support.
Thank you, Mike. And before I call on you, Diana, I do want to point out Vanna's note in the chat about LFW paying stipends of $2,000 a year, and I would like to just point out how radically different the Attorney General bill was that got passed last year, that gave substantially more money to people with lived experience serving on boards and commissions. And the first step that AOC did was to say that they were not bound by the Attorney General's bill. So I think that this is something, as Mike and SB have mentioned, is something, and Diana, that we will continue to advocate for. Diana.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to follow up with AOC to learn more about their policy. The email that Christopher, their director of finance, shared is they've capped it at $600 per year, regardless of how many activities, how many meetings, for logistical reasons. And I'm just guessing, so we'll have to follow up and ask, but once you hit the $600 amount threshold for giving money to someone who's not an employee, that's when there's tax implications. And so that's what I'm guessing, because so if you give more than 600, you have to have somebody fill out the tax forms before you can give them money. And so I'm guessing that they don't want to have to deal with collecting forms and all of that and reporting taxes. And so if they just say it's 600 or less, then they don't have to deal with it. That's just my guess, but we can ask if that is the reason.
Thank you, Diana. Could possibly be. Cesar.
We actually don't have a formal policy for our board of directors, and our federal regulations require 1/3 of our board members to be client eligible for federally funded civil legal aid services. We did undertake some discussion about this at the board level during the pandemic. There was a fair amount of conversation, and the preliminary research we did landed in the $600 number, as Diana reports, does get tied into the issue of taxes and whether a 1099 has to issue or not on the one hand. On the other hand, there are two other considerations that come up, and for our purposes, if our clients are at the poverty level, as many are, and some of them are, what's the word I'm looking for? They may be in any manner or number of benefit programs, then it becomes a question of being disqualified or having benefits reduced as a result of going over a certain amount of dollars that someone is getting. We can think of it as a stipend all we want, but it's income for purposes of federal benefit programs. Thank you very much. Lastly, and I'll make one other last comment regarding some of our conversations, which we are restarting again. We had to take a little break last year, but the last issue is the problem of it's not just tax implications, it's whether or not the entity, and in this case, the ATJ board may be a little different, but the entity is actually, if the so-called, if the compensation the stipend that's being paid crosses the line in terms of amounts or something to the point where it's arguable that the person is being paid for services, so it's really employment. And so that's a whole nother set of considerations. The two comments that I want to make based on the conversation today is, I think there's, the AG's bill and the whole issue of boards and commissions and government institutions, whether executive branch or otherwise, I mean, that's all well and good, and it's very important. I do think there is a consideration given the proposal on the table, if you will, that, if you want some of these nonprofit legal aid providers and so on, if the expectation and if the ATJ board is going to set a, what was it, $9,000, $10,000 a year, and folks have board members, that's going to become a budgetary impact. Certainly it's not an issue at NJP's level, probably, potentially, but what does that mean for purposes of a small organization that is trying to walk the walk, if you will, walk the talk. So that is an interesting consideration when I heard the earlier comment. I think I had something else to add, but I've lost the thread, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cesar. And I noticed in the chat several other comments, several from Murph about community members not wanting to be paid because they want to be treated as the same as other board members, but also the benefits issue. And then Vanna says, Fred mentioned possible new path for board members, employment opportunities to avoid these financial issues. So I think it is, right that it is the Access to Justice Board that is pushing this issue. And I think that, I know that we will continue to push this issue. And some of these, again, on a personal level, I'm just surprised that the Attorney General didn't think it was a problem, but the AOC did. And the $600 limit, Diana, your comments about that and the tax forms are quite interesting. SB.
I just wanted to say that this whole issue is a huge paradigm shift in terms of how we look at decision making in any area. Right now we're talking about the legal system, in our state. It could be education, it could be healthcare, it could be whatever. But it's a huge paradigm shift. The first paradigm shift was you need to have people in the community on your boards, in your committees. Those voices have been absent forever. They need to be part of it. And then the people that have been part of it are getting paid by their employers, but the community people have not been they're not getting any money. They're volunteering 100% of their time and resources to be part of this. And so So now we're talking about compensating so that there's some kind of fairness in that equation. And so, so it's a huge shift. And I mean, the way, I might be thinking, some people think, oh, SB, you're pie in the sky again, but I don't think it's pie in the sky. I think it's where we're heading, is that at some point we have to have structures that it's a natural, it's a given that if you're going to put together a board, if you're going to put together a committee, you're going to need community representation, people with lived experience in those areas, because they are closest to the problem and closest to finding solutions and partnering with others who want to do that. And so that would happen, that would be kind of an automatic thinking. It's not automatic right now. And even when people are doing it, we're all still learning how to do that. And then to pay them on top of it, that's a huge shift. And so, it'd be nice at some point that if we had some kind of state funding that was just for that. So nonprofits, entities that want to do that, you could just tap into that pool of resources. Maybe not state, but some kind of a resource that is available for that. We're not there yet. We're so far away from that. But I'm hoping that that's where we're heading, because it's a natural process in order for us to really change and restructure our legal system. And we can't do it without community input. Anyway.
Thank you, SB. Thank you. And we all also are including that in our budget for the Access to Justice Conference, having these community voices and making sure that they have an ability to meaningfully participate. Michelle.
Thanks. And this doesn't address all of the issues that were raised, but I think one thing that is included in the board's proposal was that it's an opt-in model. So people don't, people basically sign an affidavit attesting to their participation in the board, and you would opt in to receive payment. So it's not forced upon people. So if there are issues where there might be income implications, and it's actually less helpful for folks, then they certainly don't have to.
Thank you, Michelle. Good point. All right, unless there are other comments about this, as Vanna says, opt-in and could be anonymous. Diana.
So if we're sort of concluding this agenda item, I just want to confirm, it sounds like I don't know if we need an official vote, but just with the plan in terms of moving forward that I had proposed, with the board proposing a policy to the Board of Governors, the ATJ Board proposing a fiscal policy to the Washington State Board of Governors in August. In order to get to that point, working backwards, our board, the ATJ Board, needs to develop it, make sure there's agreement among yourself, give opportunity for the community to weigh in. And so with that timeline, I just want to make sure there's consensus that we do want to do that. The timeline makes sense to you, and that Bonnie and I have sort of the green light to go ahead and start working on a draft. And if there's some other board members, maybe the folks that worked on the original proposal, want to work with us, and then we could have something to you by your June meeting. I just want to make sure that there's a green light to do that.
As you said, I don't think we need an actual vote. Should we do thumbs up? Is that right? Okay. It seems to me that yes, there's a green light. SB, we should reach out to the AG's office and have them come and explain how their bill works. One of our board liaisons works for the AG's office, but we will not put him on the spot to do that.
I can find out who Who's the, I think I know who the legislative liaison, I can find out. Can you send me an email, just as a reminder?
Sure.
Or
Thank
the-
you.
I'll send you an email now.
All right, so now we're going to move on to our biggest topic for the day, which is a follow-up to our trip to Wenatchee. Once again, thank you to Mike and to Bryn for, and hopefully I'm not leaving anyone out from the Wenatchee Planning Committee, for all the work that you did to set up the meetings. And we wanted to have a kind of an open discussion of what it was like to be with the community folks in, as they reminded us, North Central Washington. So I don't know, we don't really have a specific prompt for this. So I think it's whatever folks want to talk about from their trip to Wenatchee. Diana.
Yeah, I'm not going to share about substantively, but just in terms of a prompt, because I know when the board met, like right after meeting with the different community folks, we did talk about sort of reflections and what the experience was. And I think the idea for today is to continue to do that, but also to talk about any sort of substantive takeaways, just in the vein of the board following through and looping back on anything specific that came out of those meetings. So I think that was the idea behind today's space. Just in case some folks are wondering, like, did we already talk about it? We just want to make sure we could continue that momentum and more importantly, loop back to the folks we met with.
Fred.
One of the things that I came away from the Wenatchee meeting with was the need to pay attention to housing. We are a board that's created by the Supreme Court. We look at legal issues. We look at impediments to, to filing motions when clerks have unnecessary fees. We look at language barriers to people to be in court. We look at all of those things. But in looking at this, an access to justice issue, there are legal issues that are standing in the way of justice, and they're different from some of the issues we've looked at before. And I think it was so clear that the housing, we thought it's a Seattle problem because Seattle is so expensive. I know that's not true because it's a Spokane problem, but it was really interesting to see that the housing crisis was a huge problem in Wenatchee, in Grant County, in Douglas County, in Chelan County. In Central Washington, it's a problem as well. And there are legal issues, legal impediments in place that we can deal with that can give people good housing. If you don't have housing, you don't have a place where you can apply for a job. Just your access to all sorts of justice is a problem if you can't have a home. And there are things that we have to look at that we haven't looked at before. We look at, getting translators in place. We're looking at, clerks of the court, reporting people that are here from other countries. Those are all access to justice problems, but another one is zoning, land use, multiple housing, how you pay for housing and so forth. And Wenatchee was a wonderful place to look at this because this is not a Republican Democratic issue. There's a Republican mayor in Wenatchee that's done some amazing things in reducing the housing problems. And there was roadblocks that stood in his way, but it was great to see people from the far left praising somebody from the center right in what they were doing. But this is just a focus. There's a lot of things we have to focus on. We have to focus on language barriers. We have to focus on racism. We have to focus on income inequality. But we also have to, I think, start looking at land use issues, zoning issues and all those legal impediments that don't necessarily have to be there that can create housing. And this is a shift because we haven't looked at those things. We haven't thought zoning and land use issues. And this was not just the focus that was interesting from the YWCA and others, and one of the other organizations. This is not all about landlord tenant, making sure that we protect tenants from wrongful eviction. This was landlords, the YWCA having to evict a drug dealer so they couldn't rent units next to that. This is about fair housing is not just about making sure that tenant rights are respected. It's also about having a legal system that will encourage landlords to make their property safe and possibly create some new housing. So it's a whole new area that we have to look at and consider that I think we haven't done before, and it may be one of the biggest problems facing people in Washington as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And I'll just point out for the folks that were in my group, we heard compelling stories from Murph's colleagues at Columbia Legal Services about substandard housing supplied by agricultural producers, particularly a horrific story about when the forest fires were going on and how the landlords just literally put them on a bus and dropped them in the parking lot of the YMCA with no access to their stuff. And also how some of the landlords bar any kind of legal advisors from getting in there and informing people of their rights. So yeah, it was. I think that this happened. Their housing stock is so short that they're afraid to report their landlords or take any kind of action because there won't be another house for them in that community. So there's another dwelling for them. So there are so many issues. I agree with you, Fred, that need to be addressed in this area. Cesar.
I'm not going to go on a rant about the disinvestment in government's provision of housing among other.
Microphone down a little bit. It just, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I apologize. I've been having some problem. I'll need to get a new one.
It's less
I hope
about
this
not
is
hearing
better.
you. It's more like a buzzing sound. I don't know. It's
Okay.
like,
Yeah. I think something I'm really interested in based on this conversation, because it's clearly.
Hey, Cesar, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. There's like an electric, it's a buzz across your voice. So, in order to hear you, we have to really I got to put my head close to the, look away and try to figure out what you're saying behind that buzz.
Try it now without the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Sorry about that. I figured the solution was to unplug those. Anyway, the Murph and I cut our teeth back in the day doing nothing but housing. I did that for 20 years on public subsidized program, the works. So this is a epic kind of 50-year mess that's been building up, not to mention venture capital and all that kind of stuff nowadays. I'm very interested, and I'm putting Murph on the spot in a minute, if maybe Murph's team, Antonio, could come to share with the ATJ board about the accomplishments of this legislative session, because the state legislature has done a great deal to try to remove, for example, on the zoning issues, abolish sort of single lot requirements in communities, and based on the size of the community, allowing for 4, 6, 8 units where once there you could only have one, that kind of thing. So it'd be really interesting. And I know that at the advocate level, folks are getting some of this information that then we can use and adopt advocacy strategies, because it really is sort of an abomination that the housing, this country is just unable to provide housing for even working people, much less people who are on fixed incomes and so on. So I don't know, Murph, maybe you can see if we can arrange something like that to help the board, and also make sure that advocates around the state are identifying the areas to push on as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that is a great idea. I know there's a lot of organizing happening in urban areas on all different communities around these issues, but not so much in the rural areas. Like, I think there's a real gap there, and a gap of understanding about what's happening and what its impacts are. I'm excited that the board is hearing this and interested in it, and it would be great, I think, for Antonio to talk about this, and also for all of the alliance organizations that are doing lobbying. Caitlin and I were just talking about this, of coordinating that, and maybe there's a coordinated response around housing. I think the other big issues that folks really struggle with, the Washington State Human Rights Commission. We're lucky in the city of Seattle to have SOCR, the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, but on a statewide level, it's really challenging, I think, for folks to bring these kinds of claims, let alone bring discriminatory zoning when there is affordable housing trying to be built in more rural areas. That's a huge challenge. And of course, farm worker, agricultural worker housing is a whole nother issue. So excited that the board is interested in this. And as a former houser, really, really excited. And I think this really goes to the racial justice of the issue of segregation. And segregation is just not a city issue. I think it also impacts our rural communities and brings so much together, because the work that Carrie's doing on the STAR committee and really looking at where is the absence of support for these kinds of movements in rural areas. That's my 2 cents.
I love the use of the word houser. Thank you, Murph. Says Mike.
Yeah, so first off, I want to just thank Cesar and Murph for just allowing us to meet you with your teams in Wenatchee. I think it was, one of my takeaways from this experience of just going to Wenatchee and talking to not only legal providers, but also service providers, is the disproportionate, I think sometimes we take for granted some of the resources we have in Seattle, King County, and then we go to areas across the state where it is it's so different in terms of what does access look like. And not just in housing, but immigration rights, access to the courts, like how difficult it is to get records from different counties and getting cooperation, getting interpreters. I mean, some of the real basic fundamental access issues are not available across this state. And that is really what I think as an Access to Justice board, we really need to examine what are those disproportionate services look like across the state, and to really dig deeper into serving people who are really needing the services and access to the legal services and understanding the law, like the basic understanding the legal system in the language that people know, that people can understand, is so critical. Like, we had conversations with organizations where they, about like they couldn't have resources to even translate jury instructions to people who get jury instructions information and what to do about it, and how do they provide services to these individuals so they understand what they're so all of this information is really, really helpful. But I actually think for me, it points to what is the purpose of access to justice and what is our role? And being very clear, is our role to really, and I think this has been something that keeps coming up, like, are we just convening meetings and are we just a sounding board and listening to communities? Or are we taking the information that we are learning from communities and elevating the voices and elevating the messages to people who really need to hear what's really going on in different communities across the state? You know, one of the things that my reflection about that weekend was more around the structure and the system and the role that access to justice should be looking at and really evaluating. You know, I think it comes back to some conversations we've had in the past. Are we conveners? Like, what does that mean? Like, are we conveners or are we advocates for access to justice? And what does that gray area look like? And how do we bring in the racial equity lens that Murph, you brought into how that plays out in housing and segregated housing across, across the state? How do we actually bring that to light? So I guess my thinking of this is much more like looking deeply at the structure of the access to justice, the purpose. What does outreach look like? How are we currently doing outreach? When Van and I did the presentation about where we are on the spectrum of outreach, are we just informing communities? Are we ignoring communities, which ties into stipends? Or are we actually bringing communities into our space and into the decision making? And so I actually think that there's some systemic things that I think are really coming up to me, certain narratives from all of the stories we're hearing from different community organizations, that I actually think that we should really think about, like, how do we connect the dots and look at this on a structural level? So I think that there's some real benefits for us to do this. And I actually would like us to think about, how do we do more of this? Like, how, are there other opportunities where, I think there was conversation at our last meeting, like sending board members to different areas, having meetings across the state, really identifying what are we hearing from communities and bringing this to the Supreme Court when we have our meeting with the Supreme Court and give them the annual report. Here's what we're saying, and here's what needs to happen, and here's what we're willing to do. Like, I really think that this is an opportunity for us to evaluate, like, why we're on this board, and how do we actually move these issues so that either legislature, either the Supreme Court, whether it's the clerks, really know these are the struggles, these are the real life struggles that are the barriers to access, to barriers to justice.
Thank you, Mike, for that impassioned response. And you and I were there when the community members were talking about the guy who got the jury summons and didn't know what it was, other than it was an official piece of paper. And I guess my takeaway is there has to be a way to solve this. There has to be a way to solve this with working with their organization and some west of the mountain resources. This just seems to me, if we could get some legal expertise into these community organizations, we could further this. Not everyone needs to be represented. They just are looking for some legal information and how to do a simpler response. What do I say about my jury summons? What do I say about this? Apparently, the other big issue that we heard about was medical debt. Apparently, the medical debt is a huge issue there because people get hurt. One scenario was people get hurt on their job. Most of the jobs are agricultural. They get hurt on their job. L&I is going to pay. They go for their medical treatment, and then the agricultural employer says, "Oh no, you did this to yourself. We are not going to say this is a work-related injury." L&I says, "Well, then we're not going to pay," and then the people end up with a huge bill for their medical treatment that they got. And so there are a number of places where they need advocacy in that. But also then the next step is that we heard about is that the charity care offices of those hospitals are not actually providing the discounts that they are required by law to pay, or to discount those bills. So where people could have gotten a discount, they were not told about them. One example was that somebody who is a native English speaker called up. She got the discount on behalf of the person. They were like, oh yeah, they qualify. Where the person themselves, who was not a native English speaker, they couldn't get the discount, the charity care, not even discount, but also like writing off part of the bills. So that came up as a huge issue. And just the other one, which affects us and affects them, and somebody mentioned the STAR committee and Governor Petrasek, is if you really want lawyers in these rural areas, then we need a more robust loan assistance repayment program, or loan repayment assistance program. Is that if you really want people to go to these areas, they need to know that their student loans are being paid off. And that will get people to commit to these areas. So it was many different pieces of these stories that we heard. Other reflections on our time in Wenatchee? SB.
I wasn't able to be there in Wenatchee because I was really sick. I was also sick that I couldn't be there. I really, really wanted to be there. And we started doing these visits out to community organizations 2 years ago, right, Diana? Was it the last time? Yeah. When we were going to go out and meet. And we, in the past, were having people come to us, to wherever we were meeting, and do a presentation. That didn't, in my opinion, that wasn't going to work if what we were trying to do was really find out what was going on. So these meetings are essential, and I'm really, God, I'm fired up as to what I'm hearing. And Mike, thank you for what you were saying in terms of, what is our role? What is our purpose? And the issue, Cesar and Murph, that issue of housing and all those issues out in the rural community. Yeah, they've been there for, I know since I arrived in 1980, was dealing with those issues back then in the 80s. And so it's just figuring out how, bringing in all our allies. We don't have all the answers, and we're not going to be able to do everything, but together we might be able to do some things. And so really collaborating in a very authentic, real way with organizations and with the community. I was in a meeting, Vanna invited me to a meeting in her community this week. And I think about those people as we're talking about these and the different community meetings that are happening in Eastern Washington. And why don't we have a farm worker representative on our board? There's a lot of things that we should be doing. And I think as we're kind of becoming more aware, it's because we're out there. And so we need to stay going out there. The idea of visiting different places, board members going out and visiting different places and organizations, love that idea. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. So thank you everybody who did go, and for the reporting that you're doing back, and for the enthusiasm, Cesar and Murph and others that you have for wanting to figure out how do we really make an Access to Justice board be accountable, not just accountable, but effective, and be the most effective that we can possibly be. It's very exciting, but a lot of work.
Thank you, SB. And I'm noting Vanna put in the chat about we don't have the stamina and strength to volunteer for free. Jeremiah, you had your hand up.
You know, as I drove into Wenatchee, it was my first time to that part of the state, right there in the middle. And I remember as I was driving into, it was almost like a bowl, the way the land is set. It made me think of like a food desert, because this is the lawyer desert. This is where law on the books and law in action actually shows you what's really happening. And I say that because we just finished finals, and as I was listening about agricultural workers not having access to people who are there to inform them about their rights, one of the first cases we learned in property was how one's property rights do not extend that far to where you can preclude people from coming and telling farm workers about their rights. This case is about 50 years old. And yet here we are talking about farm workers being precluded access to people who want to tell them about their rights. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm a well-informed thinking person, and some of these songs I really haven't fully heard, because there's so many different issues with respect to access to justice out there. There are people who are screaming in silence still, and it's sad and fascinating. And I go back to what Mike said about elevating those voices. I really do believe that should become an essential role, because they still need to be heard.
Thank you. Any other reflections from our time in Wenatchee?
One thing that I was just going to share that, well, I just want to note the unified court system that comes up all the time. As also noting on the Bar Association, the Board of Governors, that's actually part of their strategic goals to advocate for that as well. Obviously, that's a gigantic thing, but I feel like, and rather than be like, that would be great, but I don't know, how can we affect that change? That's one thing. But the other thing I was going to share that I took away from the meetings was the delivery of legal services, and just the whole system is so limited to professionals, whether it's lawyers or LLTs, judges, and the community organizations that we met with, like Cafe, they're on the ground, like Mike and Terry said, talking to people about getting forms from the court. And their frustration is, what's their role? I mean, they're already playing a role, but they feel nervous about not wanting to practice law, but yet there's nobody who are helping people just navigate how to enter the court system. And so that's something that I took away from, is what is our role to play as people in the legal system? How do we create formal access or actual access, so that we're thinking beyond just legal professionals and making them feel like they're part of it? Not making them, but changing the system so that they are a part of it, whether that's legal navigators, and making it more of a systemic thing rather than just a pilot project. But that is something that I could see change happening.
Yes, and Murph's comment in the chat about that this was highlighted for folks who are undocumented in the Yakima Valley. If this is, Diana, to Diana's point about this is the unified dealing or solving the unified court system is on the BOG agenda, I hereby volunteer for our 2 BOG liaisons that I would be happy to attend more meetings to talk about the evils of the non-unified court system and what we can do. So feel free to call me. Vanna, you have your hands up.
Yes, I wanted just to say that as much money as we are investing into the OCLA director search, And all the money that's invested in the civil legal aid system, we should have budgets for each cultures, because there is no such thing as equity. There's no such thing as equality, and especially in the court system. For each culture, they need more representation and more support, and some cultures need more than others. And so if we do want to dismantle the white supremacy culture, that's what's going to be needed. We need money to invest in cultures, and not spending all this money and time and effort in the meetings to find a director. And, you know, we're investing too much time and money into one thing, and it's not aligned, it's not balanced. That's where we are failing, because we are spending too much time supporting the white supremacy culture instead of dismantling all these racist policies and systems. So until all these cultures get the support that they need, that's when we're all gonna be closer to justice. Until then, we're not doing what we should be doing to dismantle the white supremacy culture. That's it. Thank you, but I gotta go.
Thank you. Oh. And she had to sign up. Cesar, were you going to add something?
Yeah, actually, Bonnie flagged it in the chat. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I've been playing with my settings. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yesterday, we had a meeting of the DISCO Undocumented Services to Undocumented Committee, and Abby and I were there along with the committee, and this was very prominent part of our conversation. The whole question of navigators, in Spanish is another term for promotores or promotoras. And a couple of us had come, 4 of us in the committee had actually just come from the Equal Justice Conference held in Dallas, the ABA, NLABA conference. And there was a very high profile series of workshops on non-attorney representation and legal assistance. So, you know, just get the whole spectrum happening. And there's some very interesting things happening around the country in Alaska, Arizona, Utah, and that's also going to be an important part of a broader national conversation, I think, in the coming months. I think to Jeremiah's comment, I feel like every day there's an article either in Yakima or the Tri-Cities about this legal desert problem, and we're trying to do so many things around it. You know, pipeline projects. You know, prosecutors and defenders, they're having to lower bail, and even talking about, this is a whole nother aspect, but not being able to bring people to trial and having to release people because of the lack of lawyers. And I hate to say it, but you know, the impact on the criminal justice system is probably going to focus a lot more attention than the chronic problems on the civil legal aid side. But in any event, this is a very timely conversation. And as Bonnie mentioned, we're going to be reporting to the board from our committee at I think it's the August meeting, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you, Cesar. And when you were talking about other licensed legal professionals, I believe Oregon this week decided that they were going to license legal professionals, other kinds of legal professionals, to do family law and eviction defense of landlord-tenant issues, and maybe even creditor-debtor.
Yeah, I think we're going to have some interesting problems in Washington just because of our triple LT experience. Right. But this is not a problem that's going away. so we have to take it on.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we will continue to talk about our role our role statewide, our presence in communities, our continued. I think what the communities don't want is for us to fly in, hear a bunch of stuff, and then, you know, I'm sure there's some term for this, and then fly out and not have it go anywhere, but rather to help make change in their communities. Like,
Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention that we did, so Bonnie, Bryn and I actually, and Diana connected after, and we did send thank you cards on behalf of the board to all the groups, and that we would like, and part of the follow-up was that we would like to follow up with the groups that we met and to continue to build a relationship. So I think that is the first step, is building relationship and trust in communities. But just to let you know that both Bryn and I did send out cards to all the organizations, and really appreciate all of you for really being part of this experience that we had in Wenatchee. Thank you.
thank you. And as we discussed, note to self, next time we'll do the cards when we're all in the room together. So yes. All right, moving on in our agenda, but that was a really, I think, important conversation to have. I think, thank you, Vanna. Even though you're not here, I think that's a really important point about investing in communities to reduce the impact of white supremacy and to lift up those communities. So thank you for that. So liaison reports. All of the board members are liaisons to various other boards. And so we wanted to take some time to hear about what those boards are doing. So Esperanza, do you want to talk about the BJA, the Board of Judicial Administration?
Yeah. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. So the BJA. So the BJA has 3 task force that focuses on alternatives to incarceration, court security, and remote proceedings. They also have 4 standing committees, obviously budget and funding, court education, the legislative committee, and policy and planning. And recently the BJA had a presentation from Cynthia Delastrinos, I think it was in February, laying out the report on the Racial Justice Initiative. And then the board looked at, you know, what are the areas that are most that we want to focus on. And so let's see, prioritize, help move forward. Let's see. There's all these different notes in here, so give me a moment. And unfortunately, I mixed my notes up. So one of the things that came up in that discussion was the issue, one of the issues was around transparency and how for the courts to be more transparent. And let's see, excuse me. So the prioritizing was around alternatives to incarceration, data collection, and legal financial obligations. And the board broke up into different small groups to discuss what are the pros and cons, how would that happen. And so there's still ongoing discussion on in terms of that work. And of course, there's a task force on the alternatives to incarceration. And so, you know, the work that still needs to be done, it's ongoing. And but it was recognized that those are definitely the areas that the board wants to focus on. Let's see what else. Each month when the board meets, there is a small group discussion. And the last couple of group discussions was on accommodations for people with disabilities. And let's see. And of course, the recommendations for the Racial Justice Consortium was another part of that conversation, which are really helpful because when we break up into smaller groups, where the Chief Justice Gonzalez is the co-chair for that, will put forward some questions for discussion in for those areas. One of the issues that has come up recently is of concern is around access to technology, and in particular for the elderly not being able to, not having the information or the knowledge on how to utilize and navigate the technology when so much of what's done in the court is online. And on top of that, the concern about people that have no access at all, either don't have internet, don't have computers. And we've had that discussion often in our meetings. And of course, this is where we hear about different events and conferences and what have. There's the Judicial Leadership Summit that's is going to be June 16th. There's also the Supreme Court Symposium next week, I believe, that it happens. Part of the Board of Judicial Administration, one of the responsibilities I have is being representative on the Public Engagement and Education Committee. It used to be called Public Trust and Confidence. But last year, this committee went through a lot of work in redoing the charter and renaming the committee to be more reflective of what the focus should be on the committee. Public engagement and education rather than public trust and confidence, because you have to have a relationship for trust and confidence to be built. And there was a recognition of that. So we, in the charter, which took a lot of work to do, we really clarified membership. And one of the issues that came up was around having community members and people with lived experience. And you should know that in discussions around compensation for lived experience, that this committee utilized the material that had been put together by the ATJ Board, because we had talked about that. And so there's, so the work that we're doing as a board is seen as a resource by some of the other committees to look at and see what it is that we're doing. We're being followed. And there's also a blog for the Public Engagement and Education Committee that shares a lot of information. And I'm going to see if I can drop that into the chat, because you can access the different kind of monthly. I'm not good at this, so bear with me. But I'll drop it in the chat so people can take a look at it. We have a meeting coming up tomorrow, next week, next Friday, and the next time I report, I'll have more. The last couple of meetings I have not been able to attend, so I was really looking at our board minutes. I'll be in the next meeting. We don't meet every single month. Something comes up, something happens, or else it's a month that is busy with other activities that takes the time up of a lot of the folks that put these meetings together. So the last time the board met was in March, and it'll meet again next week. And so I'll have more to report then. Okay.
Thank you, SB.
Mhm.
Questions for SB? Fred, you want to talk about the practice of law board?
Since I'm last, I'll try to go quickly and I'll deviate from my outline here. The practice of law board is chaired by Michael Cherry, who is a really interesting guy, an innovative guy, a person that has thoughts that take the board in different directions than we thought. And there's a lot of things over the last year. Their executive summary is good if anybody wants to look at it. They've focused on education, innovation, and coordination, those three things. But I think I want to talk a little bit about what they're doing on innovation. This is prompted a little bit from what Michael Chin had talked about, is that, are we just convening meetings? What the practice of law board under Michael Cherry's direction has been really trying to figure out some rulers to measure change. I mean, what are we making any difference? One of the things that they would work on, and what Michael Cherry had thrown out is, for example, think about what the practice of law board, is dealing with the regulation. People think regulation of lawyers and who's a lawyer, but you need to think, are what we're doing, what we're spending our time doing, is it really focused on what we're supposed to do? And for example, we want competent lawyers. I mean, the practice of law board is all about, competency, but, and we think that competency is checked by having a bar examination. Has anybody really tested it? Is the bar exam a really good measure of what makes a good lawyer? Maybe it is, because what correlates more with not with your writing on the exam, but the fact that you can sit in a chair for 8 hours, 3 days in a row. Maybe that's the better measure of who makes a good lawyer. It shows that they're willing to work hard. I'm reminded of some studies of does LSAT make a difference in how you perform in law school? And one study I read that said that, I'm not going to say which way it correlated, but height correlated better with the success in law school than did the LSAT score. But then does success in law school correlate to being a good lawyer? We really need to look at issues, think outside of the, that's really a terrible thing to say, thinking outside of the box, but we have to think new ways. We keep going along practice, and we think what we're doing makes sense, is that we're going, to translate from the practice of law board to us. We think talking to people in Wenatchee is going to enhance the access to justice. Well, intuitively, we think that's true, but if we don't follow up on it, it certainly doesn't. So I think this idea that the practice of law board is looking at trying to come up with these rulers to measure the change is something that we should think about as well. Shifting to one of their other areas, coordination was one of their 3 areas. Innovation 1, coordination 2. There are some interesting things that make the headlines. I think you probably all read about a Spokane Valley tax preparer. It was in the Spokesman Review, and I think it was also in the Seattle Times. Maybe if this guy was good at what he did, it wouldn't have mattered, because he would provide access to justice. But it was more about making money. And he said he was a lawyer, he could do this stuff because he was a member of the American Bar Association. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a member of the American Bar Association. Just like for me to perform weddings, federal judges have to be ministers, so I pay $15 and join the Universal Life Church. Doesn't make me an experienced minister or understand what they have to do. But the Spokane Valley tax preparer was admitted to some tribal courts. He's no longer been admitted there because he's done a bad job, and he's admitted to the American Bar Association, and so he advertises as he's a lawyer. Well, he was charged, and there was a coordination between the practice of the law board and the Attorney General's office. And really, the way they've been attacking these things is you can't get prosecutors to prosecute, but you pursue it on consumer protection grounds, and that's the big thing. In the creditor-debtor field, you get unlicensed people helping debtors fill out bankruptcy forms. The problem I see is not so much that they're unlicensed, but some people are just doing it to make money and not doing a good job. If they're unlicensed and doing a good job, doesn't really matter. If they're unlicensed and getting in there and lying about what they can do, it does. So the sort of it is, to protect consumers, it's not going to be the prosecutor's office that's going to go after this. It's probably going to be in the future, it's going to be consumer protection advocates. Something that, Cesar, you in NJP, and while I was there, you did this, and I think you're still doing this. There are consumer protection actions that can be brought that can really enhance the access to justice, where the prosecutor's office is not going to do it. It's going to be because people lied and cheated to their to the people that they're allegedly serving. I'm rambling here. I'll open it up if somebody has any questions about the Practice of Law Board. I could answer them, but also you could contact Michael Cherry if you had more questions.
Questions for Fred?
You don't feel like you have to ask me a question. It's fine. Thanks.
Well, I just have a comment, and that is that the Practice of Law Board spent a considerable amount of time working on how to regulate online legal service providers where there's not a person, but just an algorithm, right?
Yeah.
And for right now, my understanding is that whole discussion is shelved. Is that correct?
Yeah, it part of it is that on the online, they were getting all sorts of, it's a funding issue. They don't have funding to look at this as much, and partially because funding and dealing with innovation there is all going to this AI. That's the popular place where money's going. You know, and it's an interesting thing is that maybe you're going to license things other than lawyers, and we have to look at innovative things. It's not necessarily bad that it's not a lawyer doing it. It's just what we have to make sure that whoever is doing it has the right motivations. Now, it can be an appropriate motivation that the person that's providing the services gets paid for their services. If they're providing good services and the value that they're being paid for their services matches, great. But so many of these people that get into these legal help programs are just scamming innocent people. So some of these programs may very work well, but what was the motivation for the people to create these online services? Was it to make a buck? It's kind of like deodorant companies trying to tell you you stink in places you didn't know you stink, so you must buy this product. It can be, you know, you could have some AI that's translating a form for you, and it could be, you know, a great service. But if somebody's translating forms for you where you can get and charging you a $50 fee where you can get it for someplace else for free, then it's a problem.
I'm trying to steer away from the words AI, but getting pulled back in. Mike.
Hi, Fred. I have a question. Does the board that you serve on, or that you're a liaison to, does it also look at kind of access to, you know, for the bar for people who were formerly incarcerated? Does that also kind of is that the board that oversees kind of, you know, bar exam acts, you know, looks at demographics of who's the passage rates on things, or any of those sort of?
You know, Mike, I don't know, but I think that there's other areas look at that for the practice and fitness and so forth. I think there's others, but I don't know that answer, and I'm happy to look a little bit more. Maybe Terry, you seem to be nodding. You may know the answer to this better than me.
And I think Diana may know it better than me, but I don't believe so. Unauthorized practice of law is traditionally, my understanding was it was people who were doing legal practice, legal advising with different than people who want to get a license, the character and fitness. And I don't know if that comes like under Office of Discipline. I'm not quite sure. I don't know, Diana, if you
years ago, historically, the Practice of Law Board was really sort of designed to protect lawyers, you know, not let people compete with them, you know, somebody that was not practice of law, somebody that had not gone through the system. You know, it's changed, you know, but it's still, you know, you're not going to get any form preparer that's not a lawyer. You're not going to get prosecutors to go after them unless they were really hurting people doing it. And And if they're hurting people, it's probably the best way to get them is they're hurting them, they're probably getting paid, and then but he could get some money by bringing a Consumer Protection Act claim against them.
Yes, no, thanks.
So
I
things
didn't know which board dealt with those issues. Okay.
And as Diana put in the chat, the Supreme Court created a task force looking at accessing entry to the profession, and that is chaired by Seattle U Dean Tony Verona and a Supreme Court Justice Raquel Montoya Lewis, and they are supposed to be submitting their final report. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Great. I think it was a great, more interesting discussion, having many more of the parts from our working session into the public session. Any announcements that people would like to make for the good of the order? Lily.
I just wanted to share that tomorrow is Seattle University School of Law's graduation. And at the graduation, the law school is going to recognize 30 law students who have completed the pro bono pledge. For full-time students, we encourage them to complete 100 hours by the time they graduate. For part-time students, it's 50. Half of those students have gone above and beyond by completing for full-time. They've completed over 250 hours. For part-time, they've completed over 125. We know that we still have a lot of work to do to get more students involved, and we are working on that. But thank you to all of the organizations here that have provided pro bono opportunities for our students. And if you have any other suggestions, certainly please send them to me. I'd love to share them with our students.
Great, congratulations, and congratulations to them. I see Bonnie put in the chat that the Access to Justice Conference registration will open next week. Be on the lookout for that. And Murph put in the chat, join CLS partners for a review of the legislative session. It says register here, and that, Murph, are you putting the link?
Yeah, I sent it out to the ATJ listserv, so I can try to put it in the chat. But yeah, we have our update on what happened in the legislative session with bills that impact access to justice and folks that we work with and communities we work with. So it should be a great 1 hour lunch update. So I hope you can join us.
And I think you mentioned, if I saw this right, when we were talking about housing, that that some of the amendments took out rural areas, and is that, did I read that correctly?
Yes, that was for the middle housing bill. Most of some of the amendments that were proposed were taken out. And we also work closely with NJP on a bill around landlord tenant issues about security deposits and not returning damage deposits, which is huge amounts of money for folks. So that bill finally passed after, I think, 5 or 6 years.
Wow, congratulations. Any other announcements people would like to make?
I just have a question. Do we save the chat? There's a lot of notes there, and I was trying to save it and I couldn't. So, okay. I do have the sites.
I think hosts are able to capture it, but I can't say more than that.
Right, exactly.
So long as we capture, some of the things that are in there, because I think they're important. Some points that people may not make it in our minutes, but they're right there.
All right. Any last comments for the good of the order?
This is a good meeting.
This is a great meeting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very good meeting. I love it.
Our next meeting, I believe, is June 9th. So see you all there. Have a great, sunny, warm weekend in Western Washington, or also in Eastern Washington, depending on where you are.
And happy Mother's Day to everyone.
Happy Mother's Day.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.